There. So I just got home. I'm going to do a little reading for you. All right, this one's called Origin Story. Page 103. This is how it feels to be killed. That thought flashed through U.S. Navy Lieutenant John Kennedy's mind as the Japanese destroyer sliced his boat in half on the moonless night of August 2nd, 1943. Kennedy's back slammed into the boat's steel hull. A gas tank exploded, and by the light of the flames, he watched the enemy ship disappear into the dark. He shouted, "Everybody, into the water!" Most of the 13-men crew were already overboard, paddling between floating puddles of burning fuel. As the fires burned down, the men's eyes, which had adjusted to the bright flames, could see nothing. Following each other's voices, they gathered at the floating chunk of what had been the bow of their small patrol torpedo boat, PT-109. Kennedy and his crew had been patrolling passages in the Solomon Islands of the South Pacific, one of the many World War II battlegrounds between the United States and Japan. The situation was dire. The bow of the PT-109 was sinking. 2 of the sailors were dead and several wounded. Patrick McConnell was hurt the worst, with severe burns on his face, arms, and feet. Sunrise made the situation even more desperate. The closest bases were all Japanese. If anyone was likely to see them, it was the enemy. Kennedy had to get his men out of the water, the shark-infested water, but how? "We'll swim to that small island," he told the crew, pointing to the Colossal Islands, a dark shape about 4 miles in the distance. He hoped it was uninhabited. "I'll take McCullen with me. The rest of you can swim together on this plank." Someone said, "Will we ever get out of this?" "It can be done," Kennedy said. "We'll do it." Kennedy used his knife to cut the strip of material from McConnell's life jacket, leaving one end attached to the vest and locking the other end between his teeth. He began to swim, pulling the wounded man along with him. They stopped to rest every 15 minutes. It took 5 hours to reach the island. Gasping for air and vomiting salt water, their legs spliced open by sharp coral, Kennedy dragged McConnell onto the beach. Both men collapsed with their feet still in the sea. The other men crawled onto the sand. Just minutes later, they heard the hum of an engine. Everyone dove under the bushes and watched a Japanese naval ship cruise past the island on its way to a nearby base. Kennedy's injured back was beginning to throb. He and his men were stuck on a tropical island about the size of a football field. There were a few trees, but no edible plants. No fresh water. They were surrounded by Japanese bases. The nearest Allied-held island was Rendova. They could see Rendova Peak in the distance to the southeast. It was 40 miles away. The lives of the 11 young Americans, including 26-year-old John Kennedy, the President John Kennedy, could easily have ended right there, on the spit of land on the Solomon Islands in the middle of World War II. 3 days later, 2 young men were paddling their canoes near tiny Nauru Island, about 2 miles southwest of the Colossal Island, when they spotted something interesting. Bayuku Gaza and Yoroni Kamazo were both in their late teens, both fishermen and canoe makers born on nearby islands. Both had volunteered for the perilous job of scouting for the Allies, observing and reporting on the movement of Japanese forces. Cautiously, they paddled closer to Nauru. Stuck on the reef near shore was the wreckage of a small Japanese boat. Kasa and Kumana decided to take a look at the wreck, see if there was anything worth salvaging. And it was a good find. Maps, cooking pots, a sword, a gun. They started gathering the stuff, then froze when they noticed they were being watched. 2 men stood on the beach of the Nauru Island staring at them. Gaza and Kumana couldn't make out details from their distance, but figured the men must be Japanese sailors from the wreck. They jumped into their canoe and they sped off. At the same time, the men on the beach dove under a bush. They, too, thought they'd just been spotted by the enemy. They were John Kennedy and fellow sailor Barney Ross. Kennedy had spent the last 3 days trying to keep his crew alive. He spent an entire night treading water between islands, fighting currents, terrified of sharks, beyond exhausted, hoping an American ship would pass. No luck. He and his crew had swum another mile to Alsana Island in search of food and water. Nothing. That morning, with his men dying of thirst, Kennedy had swum to Nauru with Ross. They saw some sort of wreckage on the reef, but were spotted by men in a canoe and dove for cover. Gaza and Kamana raced to what they hoped was a safe distance from Nauru. It was thirsty work. Gaza suggested they stop for coconuts at Osana Island. They were near the shore when a white man in rags staggered out of the bushes, waving his arms and shouting, "Navy, Navy, American, American!" Those were two of the few American English words the scouts knew. They paddled to the beach. More Americans emerged, some injured, all starving. Gaza and Kamana made a fire and shared the food they had in the canoe. When Kennedy returned to the island that evening, he tripped up to Gaza and Kumana and fell into their arms. In the morning, the group gazed at Rendova Peak, 40 miles in the distance. The Americans could never get there. The scouts could, maybe. Gaza hunked a coconut and used hand gestures to convey his idea. Kennedy understood. He took out his knife and he carved an SOS message in English into the shell of the coconut. The scouts set out to deliver the message, paddling 15 hours through choppy waters patrolled by the Japanese military, knowing they'd be killed if caught helping Americans. They showed the coconut to an amazed American officer. The crew of PT 109 had been given up as dead. The PT boat picked the men up just after midnight on August 8th, 6 days after PT 109 was destroyed. Kennedy was guided below deck, where he broke down in tears, his body strained and aching, his 6'1" frame wasted to a skeletal 110 pounds. And so, my fellow Americans, 18 years later, still thin but no longer cadaverous, John Kennedy sat in the bathtub in his Washington home, soaking a bath that had never fully healed, practicing the inaugural address he had given and will be given in a few hours. He'd worked through many drafts and revisions to get it just right, short and decisive, focused on the dangerous road ahead. He recited the lines aloud over bacon and eggs at the breakfast table. And so, my fellow Americans, Kennedy's rise had been quick. A year after World War II ended, he ran for Congress. At the campaign event in Boston, a high school student asked the young candidate what he'd done to become a war hero. Kennedy smiled and said, "It was easy. They sank my boat." That was Kennedy's style, to crack a self-deprecating joke. But he needed the PT 109 story, and he knew it. It was his origin story, proof that he wasn't just a pampered kid who'd had everything handed to him by his rich father. He was elected to the House of Representatives in 1946, the Senate in 1952, and the White House just 8 years later. With his thick, dark hair, quick smile, and custom suits, John Kennedy was something new. A stylish young president, a cool president. Voters had no idea that behind the slick image was a man who battled several chronic illnesses, who required a mix of shots and pills plus 3 hot baths for his back just to get through each day. Inauguration morning was sunny and cold in Washington, about 20 degrees. A fresh layer of snow covered the city. Kennedy stood at the podium outside the Capitol, no hat or coat, puffs of frost coming from his mouth along with his carefully crafted words. "Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty." The human species had reached a turning point, he argued, a testing point. The Cold War was going to go one way or the other, sooner rather than later. In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hours of maximum danger. Do not shrink from this responsibility. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. With one of the most quoted lines of the century, Kennedy challenged all Americans to face the coming test together. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. There's a picture of John Kennedy in the PT 109 in 1943.